Hi, and welcome to another broadcast on my YouTube channel. I'm using this to do a lot of things about expository preaching and the Apostles' doctrine. And so today I want to talk about uh, more about expository preaching, what it is, what it isn't, and look through some things. Now, the word expository is an adjective, it describes a certain kind of preaching, expository preaching. The word itself means to explain or interpret what is commentary or explanatory. So these are things that help us to understand. Basically, expository preaching is the kind of pulpit ministry that accurately interprets a Bible passage. It's Bible based preaching. It gives careful explanation of the text and the scripture, interpreting the passage and presenting it in a compelling way with relevant application to the hearer, to the congregation. And the approach to the pulpit, thus, is distinctly biblical. I believe that apostolic expository preaching is that kind of preaching that gives sound interpretation to a text. It presents the proper meaning of the passage in a logical and a unifying manner. And it shows the practical relevance of how I can use that for my daily life, or the hearers, of course. Expository preaching is that kind of preaching which arranges and presents the truth in an orderly sequence of thought that's easily to follow. It's related to the life of the listener and to how they can put it into their daily context. So the one who would be the expositor must be committed to these basic essentials in pulpit presentation. What sometimes helps us to understand a thing is to understand what it is not. So as I've now just expressed a few things about what it is, let's also take a look at what expository preaching is not. I've got 10 things I want to share with you. Number one, it is not commentary that just runs from word to word and verse to verse without really any unity or outline or pervasive drive. Number two, it is not rambling comments or offhand remarks about a passage without a background of thorough exegesis and logical order. You're not just thinking what your opinion says. You're not just looking at it how the English defines a phrase or word. We all know or should know that the Bible was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. We have to go to those definitions because as good as we get in our English Bibles, there are times that it doesn't fully give us the fullness of what that word or phrase may mean. And so expository preaching helps to do that. Number three, expository preaching is not a mass of disconnected suggestions or inferences based on the surface meaning of a passage, but not having the sustained depth and breadth study of the text. Now, I've got 7 more, but let me just pause here and say, expository preaching takes time, takes effort, takes work. But allow me to just interject and ask a question. Would you want a mechanic to work on your car and all he has is a Phillips screwdriver? What if you need a flathead? What if it requires a different tool, a wrench? Would you want a doctor to work on you or your children or your wife or whatever, and they not really have any full understanding of medical practice or science, and instead of using a razor blade scalpel, they decide they're going to use a butter knife to try to make an incision? My point is, if we expect of others to put in the effort for their careers, positions, jobs, etc., and we hold them to that standard, should we not also, as preachers, hold ourselves to a higher standard and let our congregations hold us to a high standard of biblical exegesis and apostolic expository preaching. All right. So that being said, it is hard. And I've heard people say, well, I don't have time for that. And what bothers me about that is it becomes surface, superficial preaching that all it does is fire up your goosebumps for a few minutes. But a ball game can do that. The Pledge of Allegiance can do that. If your candidate gets elected, it can do that. Your wife, gives you a kiss, that can do that. But I don't want just emotional outbursts. I don't want flashes in the pan. I don't want fireworks that look good for a few minutes and then they're gone and we have to wait till next July 4th. I want something that has depth and breadth. And so as a preacher, I'm willing to put in the effort. I have been doing my best to be expository preaching for my whole ministry, especially the last 10 or 15 years. And in those times, I've had other jobs besides preaching. And to those who are bivocational preachers and you feel like, well, I don't have the time for it, let me say you don't have to, you should take the time. It's not that I don't have the time, it's that you don't not have the time to do it because there's an effort that needs to be put forth to do this. Okay, let's continue on. Number 4, apostolic expository preaching is not just pure exegesis. No matter how scholarly, if it lacks a theme and thesis, outline, and development. So it's not just pouring out a bunch of information that's true in its exegetical context, but if that doesn't apply to the hearer, if that is not connecting with them, then you're just like a data dump. It's just coming out, and you're like a search engine. And that's not what preaching is. Apostolic expository preaching, number 5, is not mere structural outline or of a passage with a few supporting comments, but without really any kind of rhetorical or some sermonic elements to it. Number 6, it is not just a topical homily using scattered parts of a passage, but omitting discussion of other equally parts. Sometimes people, jump over a verse or they read it real fast, and because they don't want to deal with it. But a true expository preaching and study forces you to look at that and figure out what it means and answer that question to those that are listening. Number 7, it is not a chopped up collection of grammatical findings and quotations from commentaries that you're trying to fuse these elements into some kind of smooth flowing, interesting, compelling message. It is digging it out in prayer. It is putting together some of those things that make sense, but it's also having a flow to it. And I want to add this. We are led by the Spirit. We must be Spirit-led in our preaching and teaching. I loved how Paul says it. I don't want it to be enticing words of a man's wisdom, but demonstration of the Spirit and power of God. I will put forth the effort of study. I will put forth the effort of making that outline and doing my work. However, I'm not just going to get up there and spew out the information. In other words, I'm not just going to teach the subject. I'm going to make sure I'm teaching or preaching to the student or the hearer. In other words, I'm going to flow in the Spirit. And even though I've put the effort in the notes, if the Spirit leads in a way, I'm going to flow with the Spirit. And so we have to understand that. Number 8, it is not a Sunday school lesson, sort of discussion or outline, with some sort of informality. It's not just, I think a lot of times when we think of expository preaching, we think, well, that's good if you're teaching a Bible study or teaching a lesson. No, this is not separating the two. As I've said in other videos, apostolic preaching includes teaching. Again, I understand, on the surface, teaching informs, preaching inspires. But every message should be doing both. And again, like Brother Tenney used to say, it's treaching. Well, a lot of times what we think in our ranks is that teaching is this boring, dull, monotone, blah, fall asleep in 5 minutes kind of stuff. That's not preaching or teaching. That's just you're dull. You haven't done the work. You haven't prayed in the Spirit. True apostolic expository preaching includes an element of teaching in it. It'll have information. It'll have inspiration. And together, it will challenge and convict and change by the power of God the listener. Number 9, it is not just Bible reading that links a whole bunch of scattered passages together and tries to treat them as a common theme while failing to really put forth the effort of thorough contextual and grammatical study. Number 10, it is not just an ordinary devotional, some prayer meeting talk or whatever that combines a running commentary with rambling remarks and disconnected suggestions and personal reactions to some inspirational discussion, but truly lacking any kind of exegetical contextual study. So, let's go back to what it is. Webster defines exposition this way: a discourse to convey information or explain what is difficult to understand. Earlier, we talked about the whole preacher to the whole congregation. Apostolic expository preaching is the whole preacher, mind, heart, soul, spirit, preaching to the whole mind, heart, soul, spirit of the listener, of the saint, of the person in the congregation. And so, my brothers, my sisters, please put forth the effort to be the apostolic expositor. Put forth the time to dig out a text. What does a word mean? What does this phrase mean? What's the culture of it? What's the context? What's the history around it? Is it quoted in other passages? Is it a reference back to the Old Testament, or is it a prophecy of something to come yet in the New Testament? Bring those things out. Study those things. You'll be better for it. Your listeners will be better for it. And I believe you'll raise the standard and the level of biblical preaching to where it should be. God bless you. Thank you for tuning in and subscribing.